It is now my privilege to introduce David Brooks. We are now going to do the honorary degree bit where David Brooks stands there while I read some nice things about him. I first became aware of David Brooks when he was an undergraduate in the college. He had a regular column in the student newspaper, The Maroon. He's gone on to a fine career since, although I suppose from that elevated level it must all seem a little downhill. He has become a force to reckon with in print journalism and also in television, and he has published books too numerous to mention. In an increasingly polarized society, David Brooks is bipolar. He publishes in journals as widely apart as the Weekly Standard, which he helped to found on the one hand, and the New Yorker and the Atlantic on the other. He was for some time editor of the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal and is now a regular on the op-ed page of the New York Times. David Brooks calls himself a conservative, but he displays little sympathy for the kind of conservative who was called in the 18th or 19th century a liberal. The low regulation, free market, rugged individual types. David Brooks speaks up for community and virtue, including unfashionable virtues like temperance. I don't know if we taught him that. I'm sure he came to us as a constant reader. Most of our undergraduates do. But we may have given him the confidence to believe that an intelligent reader does not need specialized training to make something of work in very many fields. His interest in a wide range of sciences has steadily enriched his work. With that, I give you David Brooks.
If you're going to praise me, I want to be here for it, so apologize for a little premature entrance. It's a pleasure to be back here, and thanks so much for that. It's a little intellectual slumming to be introduced by a professor like Dr. Redfield, but I'm glad to be back in Chicago. I have a friend who calls me probably 2 or 3 times a week to tell me how I should move here. Chicago's a great city. The mayor is doing a fantastic job. And so I've kept in touch with Rahm after he left the White House. It is true, Chicago, the U of C had a profound effect on me. My favorite saying about the U of C is not the most famous. My favorite saying is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas, which I think captures the essence of the thing. I actually came as quite a liberal. I grew up in Greenwich Village in New York in a sort of a lefty household, and my parents took me to a be-in when I was 5 in about 1965, and be-ins were places hippies would go in Central Park to be. But they took me to this be-in, and the hippies were throwing their wallets into a garbage can, and they set it on fire to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. And I was 5 years old, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can, and I ran up, reached into the fire, grabbed it, and ran away. And so that was my first step over to the right. But it didn't actually take place until I went to the U of C and was assigned a book called Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. And I loathed that book when I wrote it. I wrote a whole series of papers on how stupid it was, because I wanted to think for myself and use power of reason, and he said, reason is weak. You should fall back on wise things that have stood the test of time. Then I became a police reporter in the City News Bureau, covering the South and West Sides, and I realized Burke was right. And so I became much more conservative. So it's a pleasure to be back here. It's a pleasure to be part of a humanities institute, even though I'm going to talk a little more about politics. I wrote a book recently about emotion, called The Social Animal. And my wife joked that me writing a book about emotion is like Gandhi writing a book about gluttony. It's not my natural thing. Actually, my favorite brain experiment is unfortunately apocryphal, but I put it in the book anyway, listing it as apocryphal. They took a bunch of guys, middle-aged guys, put them in an fMRI machine, and then had them watch a horror movie, and then asked them to describe their feelings toward their wives. And the brain activity was the same in both. It was just sheer panic, and so I sort of get that. And so I'm pleased to be part of something that's mostly literary and humanistic. But I'm going to descend you into the world of politics for a little while, and then we can talk about whatever you want. When I got my current job, I was given a good piece of advice by a son of Illinois, Robert Novak, who told me interview 3 politicians every day. And I don't always do that, but I often do. I try to keep in touch with politicians, and I can tell you from that much contact with the breed that they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have what I call logorrhea dementia, which is they talk so much they drive themselves insane. And so but what they do have is these intense social skills, these antennae for what's happening in the world around them. And so when you meet a guy like, say, Joe Biden, he'll stand too close to you, he'll rub the back of your head, he'll massage your cheek, and they just need to be in that contact. I was walking down the street last summer in Aspen, Colorado, because I wanted to get in touch with the real America, and I don't know what people are complaining about. It seems fine. So I'm walking down the street, and I see Bill Clinton standing there on the street. And he's watching a high school jazz band play, and I go up to him, and he starts telling me about how great the saxophonist in this band is. And because he's Bill Clinton, he's me, he has to not only talk to me, he has to get around me and touch me and do all this. So in the course of a couple songs, we moved about 50 yards with me cowering and him lurching. And so they have this ability just to be sensitive to context and great with people. And if they don't have it, they learn to fake it. And so I was covering Mitt Romney this campaign. And he was up in New Hampshire campaigning with his 5 perfect sons, Bip, Chip, Rip, Skip, Lip, and Dip. And he goes into a diner in New Hampshire, and he goes around to each table and introduces himself to each table at the diner and asks them what village in New Hampshire they're from, and then he describes the home he owns in their village, and he's going around the whole thing. And he's met like 30 or 40 people, and on the way out, he first names everybody he's just met. He's stored the names in his head. And so it was boom, boom, boom. And so I was impressed. So that was his way of being a politician, of relating. And by the way, in the middle of the campaign, he was attacked for being distant from the average American because he has this home in San Diego with this garage with these elevators for the cars. And people said, how could he understand average Americans? And I tried to argue back that he has many other homes without elevators. And the cars have to just take the stairs like anybody else. And, so anyway, that's the normal breed. That's the normal breed. But so covering Obama has been so interesting because he's not the normal breed. The crowds needs his love. He doesn't seem to need their love. And I mean this as a compliment, I think he has a writer's personality, perceptive attention to detail, but not the kind who throws yourself in, the kind who instinctively withdraws. And so it was interesting watching the evolution of someone to see if he too is so sensitive to context. And I think the lesson of the last 4 years is indeed he is. And that he's really changed quite a lot, and I think there have been at least 3 phases. The first phase, which we could call the Messiah phase, where he'd enter a room, cherubs would sort of carry him in, sort of when everything was going great. And I sort of loved that phase because everybody around him was so nice and friendly. You'd write these columns criticizing him, at least I would. And usually when you write a column criticizing a candidate or a president, the staff calls you at 7 the next morning and says, David, you're a complete and total idiot. With Obama at this moment, they'd call you and they say, David, we really like you, we respect your work. It's so sad you're a complete and total idiot. But that was that was the niceness and the bigness. You know, they had 61 major initiatives in the first 6 months of office, just the big ideas flowing out. They had these big raucous debates with Larry Summers and Rahm and people like that, just an openness. He had sort of effortless self-confidence. My joke back from those days was that in 60 years, the word Obama will be the unit of measure for self-confidence. So we'll say, oh, he has 80 Obamas, he has 120 Obamas. But over the course, as I would interview him over the course of his presidency, that would begin to change. And so there was a greater sense as the months went by of being aggrieved. This process is so stupid. I'm surrounded by people who are not really thinking the big picture. I'm surrounded by stupidity. He became very competitive. When you go into the office, he's an extremely competitive person, but when you go in for interviews, one of the things you do is they invite columnists in, say 3 or 4 of us, and they say, do you want to have a session with Tim Geithner, say? And so they bring in 3 or 4 of us, we sit around, we're talking to Geithner, and then about 15 minutes into the session, Obama bursts in and takes over the meeting. And this happens with such regularity, you can almost set your watch by it, but they don't want to announce that he's going to be there. And so when that happens, no matter who the first person is, the tone changes when he has come in. With the first person, it will be, well, we're dealing with this issue with the Republicans. We couldn't deal with those, so we set them aside. But we're making progress here, here, and here, sort of a normal negotiating conversation. And then Obama would burst in, and it would say, they're wrong. Here's how we're going to beat them. It was the level of testosterone and competitiveness would just surge because he felt himself more embattled against a foe that was simply unwilling to deal. And he also became, I think, much more insular. Over the course of my career, each successive administration I've covered has been increasingly insular from the one before. And this administration certainly continues that trend. Much smaller, Chicago-centric group. And so he really did change, and I think the campaign changed in ways that are obvious from 2008 to this time. They knew that the obvious weakness of their opponent was the Republican brand is pretty unpopular. So they ran a negative campaign. And I think it was, I forget the number of ads, but it was like 89, 93% of the ads were negative. They ran that kind of campaign, a disqualifying campaign. I think they could have balanced it with a bigger positive agenda to go along with the negativity, but they ran a tough campaign. And I found it was the worst campaign, including Romney and Obama, it was easily the worst campaign I've ever covered in my life. Because Romney was just shape-shifting all over the place, and Obama was mostly negative, and neither campaign gave the sort of speeches that you used to have to give. And those speeches were, here are my policies. They would go, you start a campaign by going to universities and giving these long policy speeches, and people like me chew over them. They realized, oh, we can skip all that. And they did. And so it was a very depressing, tough campaign. Nonetheless, I have to say, now that he's won, I thought the speech he gave on election night, which was about 4:15 in the morning or so, was incredibly beautiful. And if you saw the clip of the speech he gave to the young people in the office, where he welled up, I thought that was also incredibly. And so my hope is that the competitive juices will be gone. The fear of failure, which I think is real in him, and like all of us, will be gone. One of my favorite studies, by the way, somebody did a study of 2.5 million putts on the Professional Golfers Tour. And golfers from all distances and all conditions putt more accurately when putting for par than when putting for birdie. And that's because they fear the bogey more than they desire the birdie. We fear failure more than we desire success, which is called loss aversion. And I think he's driven by a fear of failure. So I'm hopeful that he will now relax and rediscover the largeness which is in him, which all the signs are so far. We've got a bloody year ahead of us, but so far that he is. And so I think this is the beginning of the third phase. Nonetheless, the lesson is, when you're looking at politicians, maybe like all of us, pay attention to the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error is a psychological concept that says don't ascribe to traits what is really controlled by conditions. Meaning we're very controlled by circumstances. So if you're in the supermarket and you cut in line, you think, well, I'm in a hurry, I'm cutting in line, I'm really in a hurry, this is important, I get to somewhere. If somebody else cuts in line, you think, what an asshole. And so you think, oh, for them it's traits, for me it's circumstances. But it's usually circumstances. And so Obama faces different circumstances. And so I'm going to really spend the next 15 minutes talking about the circumstances he faces, and not just in Washington, in the country as a whole. And so the first thing I'll say is I think America is in generally quite good shape. We're in a period of incredible social repair. All the social indicators that went south in the 60s and 70s are now heading in the right direction. Crime is down, divorce is down, teenage violence is down, pregnancy rates are down by a third, domestic violence is down by 50%. Especially driven by young people under 35, we're in a period of incredible social repair. They're an incredibly wholesome and responsible generation. I think they're going to have the biggest midlife crisis in human history in about 10 years. But up until that moment, nonetheless, in the realm of government surrounding our political atmosphere, and maybe beyond, I think we're in an atmosphere of creeping self-indulgence that makes it hard to be a good leader. And I'm just going to tell you a quick story of how I think we got there. And the story came to mind a few years ago. I was driving home in Washington listening to NPR on a Sunday night. And on Sunday nights on my station, they rebroadcast old radio shows. And I happened to hear a show called Command Performance, which was a variety show that went out to the troops in World War II. And I happened to hear the episode broadcast on VJ Day, live. And the host, who was Bing Crosby, gets out there and says, "We've just learned hours ago that the Japanese have announced they will surrender. I guess at this moment we don't feel too proud, we just feel humbled, and we're just glad we got through it." And I was really struck by that tone of modesty. And it was a tone repeated again and again in the broadcast. And so about 2/3 of the way through, the character actor Burgess Meredith gets out there, and he says, he reads a passage from Ernie Pyle, the great war correspondent. And Pyle had written, "We won this war because we have brave allies, we have great soldiers, we happen to have a lot of material abundance. We didn't win it because we're God's chosen people. We didn't win it because we're better than anybody else. We should just try to be worthy of the peace." And that really was the tone of the whole show. And so I turn on the TV, I get home, I turn on the TV, watch a football game, quarterback throws a pass, wide receiver catches it, and is tackled after a 2-yard gain. And the defensive player does what all professional athletes do in moments of supreme accomplishment. He does a victory dance in honor of himself. And so it occurred to me I'd seen a bigger self-puffing victory dance after a 2-yard gain than I'd heard after winning World War II. And this symbolized for me a shift in culture, a shift from a culture of self-effacement, which says I'm no better than anybody else, but nobody's better than me, to a culture of self-expansion, which says, I'm branding myself, look at me. And I do think we have gone through that shift. And I do think that the essence of the culture of self-effacement was awareness of your own weakness and distrust of yourself, which was just more in the atmosphere. And so, for example, Dwight Eisenhower was obviously head of the European theater in those days. When he was 7 or 8, he wanted to go out trick-or-treating, and his mom wouldn't let him because she thought he was too young. So he threw a temper tantrum, punched the tree in his front yard till his knuckles were bloodied, and Mom sent him to his room, and he raged there for an hour. And she finally came up an hour later, bound his wounds, and quoted him a famous verse, that he who conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city. And 76 years later, Eisenhower wrote that was the most important conversation in his life, because it taught him that he had a problem within himself, which was his temper, and that he really had to control himself and distrust himself. And I think that sort of atmosphere was more in the air. And one of the greatest men of those days was George C. Marshall, whose weakness, as he understood, was his ambition. But Marshall had a code to try to control his own weakness, which was don't advocate for yourself. And my favorite Marshall story happened in, I guess, 42 or 43. He wanted to run Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion. And Churchill told him he was going to get that job. Stalin told him he was going to get that job. But Roosevelt sort of didn't want to give it to him because he wanted to keep him close to the White House. But he calls Marshall in, and he knew he had to give it to him if Marshall asked, because that was Marshall's stature. And he said to Marshall, "Would you like to run Operation Overlord?" And Marshall said, "My personal feelings should have no bearing on your decision." And FDR asked him 4 times in total at the meeting, would you like to do this? And each time Marshall says, no, don't think about my concerns, think about what's best for you. And Roosevelt took the opportunity to give the job to Eisenhower. And Marshall was crushed by this decision. I think it was the one day in the war he went home early because he was just emotionally crushed. But that was the code. And so I think people were raised with that code. And I wouldn't want to go back to the 1940s and 50s. A lot of us were from the wrong ethnic group or the wrong gender. One of the things that when you go back and read from this period, you understand how emotionally cold a lot of the fathers were. They did not know how to express emotion. And so I would not want to go back to that. But nonetheless, that code of self-restraint was a valuable thing in a political system. And that code shifted and is gone. And it shifted for a number of reasons, which we can all point to. I think psychologists like Carl Rogers were part of it. I think the modern media's branding of Facebook is part of it. But we've become a culture much more impressed with ourselves. And that's evident in the survey data. So for example, Gallup in 1950 asked high school seniors, are you a very important person? And in 1950, 12% of high school seniors said, yes, I'm a very important person. They asked the same question in 2005, and it wasn't 12%, it was 80% who said, I'm a very important person. Psychologists have a test they give called the narcissism test, where they give people statements and they say, does this apply to you? And their statements like, I like to be the center of attention. I usually show off if I get the chance because I'm extraordinary. I find it easy to manipulate people. Somebody should write a biography about me. And so the median score on the narcissism test has risen by 30% in the last 2 decades. High school seniors were asked, would you, and this, no, actually, let me talk about self-confidence. So along with this belief in self has gone a tremendous rise in self-confidence. It won't surprise people at Northwestern of the U of C to learn that 96% of college professors believe they have above average teaching skills. Time magazine asked Americans, are you in the top 1% of earners? 19% of Americans believe they're in the top 1% of earners. Along with this expansion of self has gone a great desire for fame. Fame was a relatively low priority for most people through most of American history. But now when they do this UCLA studies of what people want in life, people list fame routinely in the top 2 or 3 things they want in life, much more than being spiritually fulfilled. In 2006, junior high school girls were asked, would you rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant or president of Harvard? And of course, by 2 or 3 to 1 margins, they'd rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. College students were asked, would you rather be famous or have a lot of sex? And by 3 to 1, they'd rather be famous. And I always want to tell them, you know, I'm on TV, I'm kind of famous. I'm 51, I remember sex. Sex is a lot better. So anyway, there's been this shift. And I think it's had some effects. And so first, consumption. There used to be a code of seemliness that you couldn't have a luxury car because people would think you were corrupted by money. And I would say that code has gone away. And so you look at personal consumption, it was very stable for 70 years, and then in the last 30 or 40 years, it's changed. Personal debt as a percent of GDP was 43% of GDP, decade after decade. And then starting in 1970, it shot up to 133%. Debt. Every generation has an incentive to spend on itself and push the costs on the next generation. But if you see yourself as one piece of a long chain of generations, you're going to feel a moral abhorrence about doing that. All generations until this one have felt that moral abhorrence. We clearly do not. Third, CEO pay. When we in the media started publishing CEO salaries, our supposition was they'll be embarrassed, they won't want to ask for high salaries. But now, of course, it's the scoreboard. risk. If you have a modest sense in your ability to calculate risk, you want to be reasonably prudent. But as we just saw what happened on Wall Street a few years ago, that prudence, not much in evidence. Fourth, polarization. If you think your conception of the truth is flawed, if you think most big debates consist of competition between partial truths, then you need the people who disagree with you to correct your own biases and errors. But if you think you have truth by the short hairs, then the people who disagree with you are just in the way. Fifth, tribalism. If you think the line between good and evil runs through yourself, then you're going to have a certain sense of sympathy for people who disagree with you or in another group. If you think the line of good and evil runs between different groups, then your attitude's going to be very different. Distrust. The most important polling statistic in America is, do you trust government to do the right thing most of the time? For the first 70 years of the 20th century, that level was about 70 or 80% year after year. Today, 19% of Americans say that. And that's partly because government has not been so great. But government wasn't so great either before. It's in part because we think we're superior to whoever's governing us. I think we've become worse followers, not only they've become worse leaders. And so these are all real-world effects that I think make it hard to govern, that cause the polarization, or at least contribute to the polarization, that contribute to the debt, that contribute to the distrust. And so I think, at least in the public sphere, but not in the private sphere, but in the public sphere, we've become much less good at self-restraint. We punish politicians who ask for sacrifice and reward politicians who tell us that won't be necessary. We have no ability to police the politicians on our own side who are dishonest. I really was struck by this campaign of how many ads were blatantly dishonest. And we have these things in the media where we do these, we give out 4 Pinocchios, these fact-checking squads. And our supposition when we did this, that we'll shame them. We'll give an ad 4 Pinocchios and they'll withdraw it. But the consultants told us, no, we want the Pinocchios. It shows we're hitting them hard. And one of the things we learned in this campaign is there is no penalty for being dishonest. And believe me, both campaigns have extremely good fact-checking organizations. When they do it, they know they're doing it. But they did it because they think it works. Third, along with this self-expansion has gone much more what they call epistemic closure, people locking themselves in information cocoons. And if you needed evidence that people are really locking themselves in information cocoons, look at Karl Rove's walk down the corridor in Fox on election night, really believing that there's no way we cannot win this thing. And one of the reasons it took so long for Romney to concede was they could not accept it because everything they had suggested, oh, we're going to win this. I actually went out to dinner the night before the election with a couple of Romney staffers, and one of them was pulled away to work on the victory speech. And I said, well, have you guys worked on the concession speech? And they said, we don't have a concession speech. And so, you know, there is a chance. I mean, if you read the paper, I felt like saying, don't you read Nate Silver? I mean, and so the epistemic closure, and I should say, just so liberals don't feel good about themselves, one of my favorite studies is they give people tests. They answer, how do you answer this question, these surveys on a bunch of policy areas? And then they say to conservatives, now answer the survey as if you were a liberal. And they tell the liberals, answer the survey as if you were a conservative. Conservatives are very good at predicting how well liberals would answer the survey. Liberals are awful at predicting how good conservatives would answer the survey. I don't know why that is, but I think if you're a liberal, it's easier to be in an epistemic loop of, dare I say, reading the New York Times and listening to NPR, and not. And so, so there's been a closure of epistemic loops as the self has expanded. There's also been a wider segmentation of the electorate as people hive off, and this is related to people like themselves. The number of counties in this country where one party or another has a landslide majority has doubled in a generation. As liberals move to liberal areas, conservatives move to conservative areas, and neither the twain shall meet. This was especially evident and more painful for the Republicans because their vote is basically white now. And one of the things that's happened over the last several decades is that in 1980, the electorate was 88% white. And it's been a slow slide. This time it was 72% white. And if all your voters basically are white, as the Republican parties are, that means every 4 years you are losing 1.75% base, inexorably, 1.75, 1.75, 1.75. And if you can't get out of your segment, it's just a gigantic problem. And so all of these things, all these bad habits, I think are a product of the expansion of self, the loss of self-control, the loss of self-restraint, which has made politics more indulgent, more polarized, people more satisfied with themselves, less curious about their opponents, less knowledgeable about their opponents. And I say that because I think it's on the mass level, the cultural level, not only within the Beltway, though all of these problems are magnified within the Beltway. And so as we look forward, I think we're in a situation like the 1880s. We're in a situation where we've got tremendous innovation in the economy. We've got tremendous growth. We happen to have a political system, and in some ways a national political culture, which is fundamentally dysfunctional. And that's the thing Barack Obama is now faced with. And I think the fiscal cliff is actually the first step to either get out of that or not get out of it. Now, whenever I mention the fiscal cliff to people outside of Washington, I can just see eyes shutting down. The word fiscal is like an anti-aphrodisiac. It's like it just, it's like fiscal cliff is what accountants use to commit suicide or something. But what this is about, it seems to me, is about going from a lack of self-restraint to self-restraint. It's like joining AA. When you have something that's out of control, as our spending is, as our polarization is, you don't defeat it by just staring at it and saying, I will be a better person, I will exercise my willpower. You create a series of stupid rules to control your own appetites. You do the Atkins diet and you rule out carbs. If you're Jewish, you adopt the rules of kashrut, of being kosher, and you say, I will not eat a cheeseburger. You have rules, and you embed yourself in a system of rule-bound habits. That's what the fiscal cliff is about. It's about coming up with the rules so we're more self-restrained about our spending, we're more disciplined about the way we tax people, we're more disciplined about the way we regulate, and we reverse some of the slow slide that has afflicted the country over the last few years. The economic slide, we've grown for the past 60 years we generally have grown 3.3% over the past 60 years. We're projected to go by 2.3% over the next 30. That 1-point gap has huge social consequences. The slide in political dysfunction, which to me is symbolized, I do these Sunday shows, and the fun of doing a Sunday show is you meet in the green rooms with all the newsmakers for the hour before you're on the show. And they've begun occasionally to ask the Republicans and Democrats for separate green rooms because they just don't want to talk to each other. And so these are all things that are a failure of self-government. The fact that in 2019, the federal budget deficit, the payments on the interest alone will be $919 billion, which is greater than the projected defense budget. That's a loss of self-discipline. And the fact that we can't do anything about it is, again, a loss of normal prudence that I think, again, has these cultural roots. And, when I will say, coming back to Obama and coming back to people like John Boehner, individually, these are very talented people who are stuck in this awful system. And I think they all want to get out of the system. They all want to impose a system of restraints. And they're challenged in trying to do that. I'm temporarily hopeful they will, but the fiscal cliff is really the emphasis to begin to establish some rules, and through the rules, to reverse some of the cultural slide that I've been describing. And I think it would help, I'll just finish on this, it would help if there was a movement, a political movement, which had a series of ideas that would impose its own restraints. One of my problems with politics right now is that we've got a liberal movement that believes in enhancing equality through government. We've got a conservative movement that believes in enhancing freedom by limiting government. But there was a system, or a belief system, through much of American history that believed in limited but energetic government to enhance social mobility. And this was founded by Alexander Hamilton. And as some of you know, when Hamilton was 12, his mom died in the bed next to him. He was adopted by an uncle who committed suicide. He was adopted by his grandfather who died within a year. And so at 14, he had nothing. By 25, he was George Washington's chief of staff. By 35, he had co-written the Federalist Papers and was a successful lawyer. By 45, he retired as the most successful Treasury Secretary in U.S. history. And so his was a story of awesome social mobility. And he tried to create a philosophy of using government to give people the tools to compete in an American economy, a capitalist economy. It wasn't as big government as modern liberalism. It wasn't as limited government as modern conservatism. It was sort of in the middle there, but it was all oriented around social mobility. And his tradition was carried on by the Whig Party in the 19th century, the early Republican Party, maybe Theodore Roosevelt, and then it just dies away. But it seems to me that tradition focuses you on what you need, what the country needs right now, which is greater social mobility, an effort to tackle inequality. And without that idea system, I think it'll be hard for Boehner and Obama to focus their efforts. It'll be hard to form a center because the center will be without ideas. And so to me, that's the unfinished job. And I want to pull aside, I'm not sure there are any Republican super PAC donors in the crowd. I kind of doubt it. But if you are, my message to you is spend a lot less on marketing, spend a lot more on product development. You know, they wasted hundreds of millions of dollars on one ad after another, which had no effect. Send out some researchers to Akron, Ohio. Figure out what a 12-year-old boy or girl needs at each step in life to really rise, and offer that. And that would be what they should do. So, so I've painted somewhat of a negative description of parts of American culture and our American political system. I just didn't want to leave you with a sense that I'm a pessimist about the country. I'm a short-term pessimist about our fiscal situation, but I'm a long-term pessimist about the country because while I think the self-indulgence, optimist, did I say it wrong? Okay. Let me call Dr. Freud. And I say that because while I do think this rise of ego is real and it's measurable in all sorts of data, there are parts of the country which are essentially still consistent with what we've always been, with what Alexis de Tocqueville found when he came here in the 1830s, and what has always made us a great country. And I always say, and I wrote in one of my books, if you really want to understand America, the essence of the country that has always given it the energy, the vitality, and the creativity that propels it forward, you got to go to Home Depot in a suburban big box mall, and you got to watch a man buy a barbecue grill, because that's when he's most emotionally exposed. And he's going out into the Home Depot. He's doing the manly waddle men do in the presence of large amounts of lumber, and he goes in and buys a Weber Genesis grill, because in America it makes sense to name a barbecue grill after a book in the Bible. He's going to buy the 942-inch grill surface in case he gets the urge to roast a bison. And he's going to take it out to his car out in the big box mall, and you know, you've all been in these things where there's like a PetSmart over here, a Petco over there, a Bed Bath & Beyond, linens and things. Way over to the curvature of the earth, you can see an Old Navy, like sort of over here, the progressive grocery stores like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. Actually, my favorite section of those stores is the snack food section, because they couldn't have vulgar snacks like potato chips. They have these seaweed-based snacks, what we buy in my house. It's called Veggie Booty with Kale, which is for the kid who comes home and say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colorectal cancer. And, so there's those stores. And then finally, there's the Walmart over here, and my favorite store, which is the Costco over here, which is sort of the Walmart on acid. 'Cause you can get your bags of 60 pounds of tater tots, box 300 pounds of detergent, packaged with 6,000 Q-tips, which is 12,000 swabs because there's one at either end. Everyone's having the same conversation, which is about how much money they're saving by buying in bulk. So they'll say, we should get 15,000 popsicles because we were thinking of having kids anyway. And so I look at these stores and I think, who comes here shopping for condoms? Because the quantities are so gigantic. And that's what I'll leave you with. There are a lot of optimistic people in America. So thank you very much.
Gary Drimmer, quick question. Do you feel as a thinking, rational conservative that you are an endangered species?
Well, my joke that being a conservative at the New York Times is like being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not always a lot of company. I do think, I'm a certain sort of Burkean conservative, and more communitarian than the movement is right now. I fundamentally think it's a mistake to divide, which the movement does right now, base your whole philosophy on big government versus small government. If we could have a vital, mobile America with big government, I'd be for that. I mean, I'm suspicious of planning. I'm much more suspicious than the president of centralized planning. So that makes me more conservative than him. But nonetheless, if you look at, and one of the things I did this week after the voting totals came in, I looked at attitudes of Latino Americans and Asian Americans. And two things really leap out at you. One, incredible commitment to work. And two, an incredible commitment to certain sorts of government programs. Education, early childhood, job training, Pell Grants. And so if those government programs can arouse energy, work, and ambition, it seems to me that's what people who believe in a free market should celebrate. Now, on the other hand, I think probably more than most people in this room, a lot of government regulations impinge on energy, entrepreneurialism, and ambition. But making it simply big government versus small government means you're not relating to people as they really are. And so I have a problem with an entire political system based on just shrinking the size of government from 22% to 19%. No one really cares what percent it is. It's what kind of country we have. And so that, in that sense, I am out of step. And I grew up at a time with William F. Buckley and much more Burkean, much more thinking. My version of conservatism is based on the phrase epistemological modesty. The world is super complicated. We really probably have very limited understanding of it or ourselves. We should be modest about how much we think we can plan. And so that's the kind of conservative I am, but it's a little out of step, but bound to come back someday.
Do we have a question on the far side? Any hands? Okay, we've got one over here.
Hello, my name's Steve Mann, watch you every night. Part of the crime problem, part of what you just talked about, we have a big problem in this city. It's not in this part of town. And the president addressed it when he was talking about gun control, and somebody who mentioned they wanted to get rid of automatic weapons, but then he said we've got a problem with ordinary handguns here. how would you address the violence that we have in this city and that they have in other cities? How would you raise everybody's level? You mentioned, well, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah. So, I guess the first thing to be said is nationwide crime is down 70%. It's one of the tremendous achievements of the current era. The question is why? And the short answer is we don't really know. Social policies rarely have big effects. If you can get a marginal effect, if you can reduce crime by a little, if you can reduce poverty by a little, if you can increase graduation rates by a little, you're doing a good job. But we've had this tremendous effect in crime, which we don't know. And I assume it's an emergent property, that is to say, the fusion of a lot of different things where the sum is greater than the total of the parts, if I've said that correctly. And so there's probably a bunch of young boys mostly who took a look at their older brothers who were dealing crack and said, I don't want to get shot. It was probably partly community policing, probably some consolidation of the drug trade. But nonetheless, the drop in crime has transformed cities, including this one. Though obviously, and I'm not going to tell you about Chicago's crime problem, I only know about it third hand. But it seems to me it's mostly a gang problem here. And I assume these things, people are not stupid forever, that they will solve the gang problem themselves. There will be some consolidation. That doesn't solve the drug problem, and that's in some ways not a moral answer, that we should just hope there's some hegemonic gang leader who establishes order. That would not satisfy most of us. We have a better organization of our gangs. Nonetheless, I do think it would reduce the murder rate.
My name is Rachel. Could you comment on General Petraeus and the dilemma we're in?
I actually was going to talk about that. I know him a bit. He's a wonderful guy, and I do think he did heroic work in Iraq and really did very brave work. Going into Afghanistan, accepting that assignment was a high-risk endeavor, really putting his reputation on the line. And then I actually had dinner with him a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him about the CIA, because I thought a lot of military people don't necessarily have the best attitudes toward the CIA. And he said, I'm in awe of this people, because everything they do is in secret. And they'll never get any rewards, no psychic reward. They can't even go home and tell people what they do. If you're a military person, you walk through the airport these days and people appreciate what you've done. If you're in the intelligence agency, that never happens. And he says, I'm in awe of their commitment. And so as a public person, I still have to say I respect him. I have French attitudes about these sorts of things, but I should say, in case my wife ever hears about other people, occurs to me. But when you're head of the CIA, it's obviously a problem. And so I think it's just hard, the people who have these ambitions, they want to be loved. And they're in a position of great charisma, and people around them have tremendous worship for them. And it's not totally surprising that somebody would succumb to this. I will say, I don't know if you guys have seen this, and I should say this has not been confirmed, but it's all over Twitter. There was a letter to the ethicist in the Sunday New York Times Magazine. If you go online, you'll find this letter. And it's from a man who says, I know that my wife is having an affair with a person in a senior leadership position in this government. And I really admire this man. And I really believe in what he's trying to do. Should I expose the affair? And so when you read this letter, you'll see it online. He wrote it, I think, in July. And we assume now that it was about Petraeus. These are why you should study the humanities, because you would never imagine these sorts of issues. I always tell students, if you want to cover politics, it always gets back to the heart. You can try to be an economist and, cut yourself off beneath the neck, but it goes back to the heart in all circumstances. So the bottom line for me is I still tremendously admire him. I understand the weakness and the stupidity, but I hope that he has something, I'm convinced he has something great to contribute. And if any of you are on the board of Princeton University and you need a president,
Okay, we have time for one more question and answer. We have a lot of patrons with tickets to shows that they have to get to quickly, so we do need to end on time. So this will be our last question today, and we thank you all so much for coming. Please state your name.
My name is John Dunn. I'll try to make this quick. How do we encourage people to step out of the crowd to run for elected office just to serve instead of just to serve special interests?
Well, first, let's talk about getting young people to serve. Because if you go to campuses, you'll find frequently they want to be Bono, but they don't want to go into politics. They've given up on political life. And I would just say to them, first of all, that being Bono is great. And doing that kind of work in Africa and everywhere else, doing NGO work is great. But first, if you do NGO work, you can only get so much done until there's good governance. So Haiti has 13,000 NGOs, and they all do great work, or maybe half of them do. But they can only improve Haiti so much until there's good governance and law and order. So government really matters. Second, the people I know who've gone from NGOs to government say the amount of good I can do in government is just exponentially bigger than the amount I could do as an NGO. The dollar amounts are much bigger. The people who did PEPFAR, the president's proposal on AIDS in Africa, had an impact much bigger. And so the people in government say, each individual day sucks, but the overall experience is tremendously rewarding. And I do think that's a message to get to young people. The second thing to be said is, to me, the special interests are now tied to tribes. There's Republican special interests and Democratic special interests. And we need people who are not as tribal. And to me, the reason that the center has very little power in this country is because they have no ideas. Liberals have academics, think tanks, ideas. Conservatives, if you go to a dinner, they have academics and think tanks. You go to a centrist dinner, it's just a bunch of lobbyists. They have no ideas and no agenda separate from the two tribal networks. And there was a movement that tried to create a center. It's called No Labels. And it's filled with good ideas, but you can't create a movement whose first word is no. You have to stand for something. And that's one of the reasons I did that little riff on Alexander Hamilton. I think that's the model. But it's having a positive view which is separate from the tribal special interest networks. That's the only way you're going to displace it. I think we're going to have a big fiscal crisis, and then we'll solve all the problems. So, thank you very much.